Hi, Peter. Welcome to University of Macau. We are so happy to have the chance to interview you. I'm Peggy.
Hello.
Hello, I'm Sherry.
Hi.
And recently we have the chance to read the Syllabary, and we have several questions for you.
And recently I read your Syllabary, so I have a question. The first is that, what drove you to write the Syllabary?
Short answer or the long answer? I'll give you a medium length answer. It started when my daughter was learning to read, and so I started writing out syllables, thinking, this is bab, beb, bib, bob, bub. And I thought, beb, why is there not a word with beb in English? And so then I started writing them all out. And by the time I'd finished it, my daughter had learned to read and she was doing other stuff. But, and so I had this big set of syllables, and I didn't really know what to do with them. But eventually I thought I could maybe try and write a little text for each group of words. And so I started doing that. But there's an awful lot of texts, so it's taken me about 20 years so far. It'll take another 10 to finish it.
So what you mentioned, I think it might take several years to complete it. So how do you maintain the patience and or interest on the Syllabary?
It's what I do. It's what I've always. It's what's always interested me a great deal. Just sitting and working with words. Not because it's words, but because it's a way through to people. I didn't invent any words, right? They're always from somebody else. So when I'm looking at a group of words, I'm looking at what made them think of that. And so when I get a set of words in front of me, it's always interesting. It's always different. So I just wait till something comes out of it.
Oh, I see. Then what inspired you to write a poem?
I think inspiration is a big word. Well, the old Scottish thing, a poet was a maker, somebody who made things, and so it's making things with words. I could be using bits of wood or something like that. And with bits of wood, you don't talk about inspiration, you just see what the material gives you and you work with it. I think similarly with poems, on occasion you can say something annoys me so much or something enchants me so much that I want to write about it. But in general, it's more a matter of taking the material I've got, seeing what I can make of it, and sometimes the material is not very good. Like the word on the syllable I was doing just recently was mooch, like mooch.
Yes.
And there's not much you can do with that. But at other times you'll have a word that's so like love, What do I do with that one? It's much more, it's only one word, and it takes much more of an effort to get it to work.
So when we write a paper or write an essay, we will think a lot. So when you compose a poem, which one is in priority? The visual effect, or the audible effect, or the theme, or the topic?
It's certainly not the topic, it's the words. So there'll be a group of words in each syllable, a group of monosyllabic words, and I just work entirely from that. It could be one word, as I just said, or it could be up to 50 words that I'm trying to work on. And so it's the phonetics first, and then for an actual poem, to me it's the rhythm. So that would be, it's very physical, it's the heartbeat, it's the rhythm when you walk, and a combination of those. So it starts off with this phonetic hint from the group of words, and then if it works, it goes on from there with rhythm.
The rhythm. When we talk about that, when we read a syllabary, some readers will feel a little bit confused because it is different from the conventional poem, especially the beginning, the middle, the end. So could you tell us a little more about what is the best way to experience the syllabary?
Well, if it helps, I could say another reason I was writing it was because I had worked on narrative poems. I'd read a lot of Hugh McDermott. I did my research on him, and he was always talking about getting a poem that could cover everything. So I wanted to be able to write a poem that could take in anything that I came across, not just the usual themes of poetry, and also to tell big, long narrative stories. But then I got a bit distrustful of narrative, because this godlike position where you decide what happens from the start to the finish, because I didn't feel that that's what life was like. And, so I wanted more something that could give an impression of what was going on. Also, it was a time when I started, it was a time when I was travelling a lot. I was living in Glasgow, I was working in Paris or Geneva, and I was travelling to various places. And I would go back to places, and it was as though I was picking up from where I left off. So it wasn't a single narrative, it was like several different things going on in parallel. And it wasn't me that decided it, it was economic principles, you know, it was where I could get work or other things. And so I wanted a form where I wouldn't decide what was going on. Mm-hmm. So when I'm writing it, I take one syllable, and then when I finish that, I throw a dice to see which one I go to next, right? And so that way, I never decide what I'm going to write in the next part. And the same way, when you read it, it's never the same order twice. So that when the parts come together, and I do think of it very much as one whole thing, it's the sequence is decided not by me, it's decided by the program.
Mm-hmm. I also have a question. Can you tell us about an occasion when you start a poem and it becomes something different from what you planned?
That's usually what happens. Sometimes, for example, when there's a big group of words, say there's about 20 or 30 altogether, I find that very hard to manage. It's very hard to remember them all for a start. So maybe you'll have seen perhaps the way they're written out. There's a kind of glyph where you get the words are all written out. You can see that in shadow on the thing. And that's just my attempt to see it all at once. But when it's a very big group, then I'll maybe write a piece of nonsense verse just to try and get it into my head, and then throw that away, okay? And then start writing something else again. Or it can happen that I finish it and put it up on the web, and then a couple of years later and say, oh God, did I write that? And then throw that away and write something else. That's not really quite what you're asking. You're asking when I'm actually writing something, if it starts one way and goes another. Yes, why? Well, you mentioned patience earlier on. Sometimes you've just got to wait till the right thing comes out. And sometimes I'm not patient enough, and I just think, oh, I'm fed up with this. Write something and just to finish it. But that's not the right way of doing it, because in a way, with the syllabary, each syllable is a landscape, and I'm the weather, you know. So the landscape doesn't change, but my mood changes.
Yeah.
So that the first time I come to it, I can work on it, and it might not make sense, it might not be suited for it. And then another time I come back in a different mood or with different experience in my head, and then that would produce a different piece of work.
So you mean the syllabary is another kind of diary of your life?
I used to keep a diary when I was a kid, but I got kind of bored with it. I don't see it, and a diary is a bit like a blog. I'd see it really in the other way. A blog tends to be quite expansive, whereas this process is rather intensive. So I'll take things that happened. Of course, my life is raw material, but I'm not particularly interested in telling you what I did last week. You know, I'll use that material, the people I've been talking to, the things I've seen, and that comes in, but it usually comes in bits and pieces. Sometimes it'll come out exactly the same way. I mean, if there's something funny that's happened, like I ran into a tramp last week. He was sitting beside the road and he said, I used to be young and pretty, but I ain't no more. And I said, me too. And he just laughed, you know. And I could see that kind of thing coming in just in itself as a little anecdotal poem. But more often it's things that, where it'll be a piece of this and a piece of that, and they come together and they're matched because the rhythm works with those particular sounds. Does that make sense?
Yes. And we also noticed that when you write a poem, you will put some scores inside. So could you tell me a little bit more about why you put it in the poetry? Because of you regard it as an experimental language or someone else?
Sorry, I put what in?
The Scottish language.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's the way I speak, really. I've been out of the country for a long time, so my accent isn't what it was before. But even the structure of the syllabary, if you look at the vowels, it's got 10 vowels. Now, somebody else would have 9 or 11 vowels.
Yeah.
Just the way I happen to speak, the vowels are sort of Glasgow, flat, a, e, o, a, e, I, o, u. And so that the very structure of the thing is my way, my own idiolect of English, so it's that. And the Scots words come in because, well, I heard them from I was growing up. I mean, in Scotland, there was a kind of class thing attached to speaking Scots.
Yes.
And my family were all Irish immigrants who left Ireland in the potato famine and arrived in Glasgow. So they'd want to be assimilated. And they spoke Ulster Scots, which was the kind of Scots that was spoken both in the eastern part of Northern Ireland and in Glasgow. And so they'd say, don't talk like your grandmother. But you'd hear all these things from your grandmother. And so these words would come in. And so they're the oldest part of my vocabulary, I suppose, and the oldest affective part where the emotions and the memories of childhood are coming in. So that's why it comes in. It's not dictionary Scots like some poets write, and there's very good reasons for doing it. In my case, it's more just the words that I remember from childhood.
Yeah, maybe because of the Scottish element make the syllabary more unique. And we also understand there is a group of the poets in Scotland who are influenced by the Edwin Morgan. We also read some computer-generated poetry by him. Mm-hmm. Could you tell me a little bit more? How do you influenced by his work?
Okay, influence is a complicated business, I guess. Let's say I'd been writing already for about 20 years before I met Edwin Morgan. I'd been writing from childhood. I met him at Glasgow University. He was my supervisor for my PhD. He was funny about computers because he wrote about computers, but he was almost scared of computers himself. He never used them. I remember one time when he was in a nursing home already, he was quite old, and I had a version of the Syllabary I'd managed to put on a laptop computer, and I brought it to the home and said, would you like to see this? He said, oh, no. So everybody has their limits at technology. So he was interested in the idea of computers. So it was an intellectual interest, but he just wasn't practically, he was almost allergic to them himself personally. Mm-hmm. As to his influence as a writer, he was a great influence, and he was a very good person. Mm-hmm. And he was a very pleasant person to talk to, and he seemed to know everything, but he never showed off about it. And so I was meant to be the expert in Russian, for example, because I'd studied Russian. But I remember asking one time, what's coming out in Russian just now? What should I be reading? And he told me 2 or 3 people I'd never heard of, and so I went off and read them. You know, this wasn't supposed to be his area of expertise, but he just did seem to know everything. Mm-hmm. He was very interested in experimental work. Of course, concrete poetry, the occasion for this, was he got onto that very, very quickly. How, I don't know, because I mean, this was Glasgow in the 1950s, it wasn't the centre of the universe. But then neither was Sao Paulo, so I guess it was through things like, he was into a lot of different networks, like with Alexander Trocchi in Paris, and the Sigma thing, who was connected with Samuel Beckett, with Gail Turnbull, who was in California at the time, and he was connected to a lot of American poets like Sid Corman, who was in Japan, right enough. And to Alec Finlay. Eddie and Hamilton Finlay had their different approaches to experimental poetry, and so did Tom Leonard. I don't know if you've come across him. He was a Glasgow poet who was very good in sound poetry. In fact, he almost went mad with sound poetry. He wrote an essay one time talking about how after one session of recording, he just had the impression that the voice of God was coming through him. And I said to him afterwards, it was a good essay that, because you gave the impression that you were kidding, but I don't think you really were kidding, were you? And he said, no. Eddie wasn't like that. Eddie was much more in control, generally, of what he was doing. And he was also very, very encouraging to people. He put me in touch with Richard Price, another Scottish poet, whom I wouldn't have met otherwise. And we've been friends for a long time and been working together on various things because of that. He was an example, I would say, as to how to go about the business of writing. Just very, very intellectually curious about everything, very knowledgeable, and always ready to share the knowledge he had. So in that sense, a great personal influence, I'd say.
Thank you so much to sharing your experience and give us such amazing work, the Syllabary. And thank you for giving us the chance to interview you.
A pleasure.
Hope you enjoy the interview, enjoy the time in Macau.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.